Rebel with a Cause. Mark Twain's Hidden Memoirs. Chapter 72, Blood-Soaked Quill, 1905. Editor's Notes. The Leopold being spoken of here was Leopold II of Belgium, 1835 to 1909, who reigned from 1865 until his death. At the time he wrote the above in 1910, Twain was apparently unaware, or had forgotten, that Leopold had died the year before. The polemic King Leopold's Soliloquy is another prime example of what has been described as Twain's pen warmed up in hell period. The moralist of the Main did not hold back a jot, and let the person he considered a poster child for evil domination have it with the full force of all the scathing denunciation he could muster. In his autobiography, Twain wrote about this situation. The royal palace of Belgium is still what it has been for 14 years, the den of a wild beast, King Leopold II. Who, for money's sake, mutilates, murders, and starves 500,000 of friendless and helpless poor natives in the Congo state every year, and does it by the silent consent of all the Christian powers, except England, none of them lifting a hand or a voice to stop these atrocities, although 13 of them are by solemn treaty pledged to the protecting and uplifting of those wretched natives. The conditions under which the poor lived in the Middle Ages were hard enough, but those conditions were heaven itself as compared with those which have obtained in the Congo state of these past 14 years. Earlier in the same year of 1905, Twain had also written The Tsar's Soliloquy, another polemic, which takes Russian Tsar Nicholas to task for having had his troops fire on striking workers in St. Petersburg, Russia, in January. In the soliloquy, published in February, Twain has the Tsar musing on other evil deeds he had perpetrated against Finland and Poland, and wondering whether he would in the end get away with it all. While Twain wrote here specifically against Tsar Nicholas and King Leopold, he was also fundamentally anti-royalist. He expressed this quite plainly in his 1891 essay, At the Shrine of St. Wagner, the relevant part of which describes a mass of people espying a princess on a balcony above them, and goes on to opine, This daughter-in-law of an emperor was pretty. She had a kind face. She was without airs. She is known to be full of common human sympathies. There are many kinds of princesses, but this kind is the most harmful of all, for wherever they go, they reconcile people to monarchy and set back the clock of progress. The valuable princes, the desirable princes, are the czars in their sort. By their mere dumb presence in the world, they cover with derision every argument that can be invented in favor of royalty by the most ingenious casuist. In this time the husband of this princess was valuable. He led a degraded life. He ended it with his own hand in circumstances and surroundings of a hideous sort, and was buried like a god. Twain elsewhere called monarchy the grotesquest of all the swindles ever invented by man. Even towards civilization in general, Twain could be quite derogatory, as when, in a 19 letter to Twitchell, he wrote the following. My idea of our civilization is that it is a shabby, poor thing, and full of cruelties, vanities, arrogancies, meannesses, and hypocrisies. As for the word, I hate the sound of it, for it conveys a lie. And as for the thing itself, I wish it was in hell, where it belongs. Biographer A.B. Payne astutely annotated one of Twain's such diatribes as follows. One cannot help wondering what Mark Twain would have thought of human nature had he lived to see the Great World War, fought mainly by the Christian nations who for nearly 2,000 years had been preaching peace on earth and goodwill toward men. But his opinion of the race could hardly have been worse than it was, and nothing that human beings could do would have surprised him. Although often expressing outspoken animosity towards mankind as a whole, as regards individuals, Twain could be almost exaggeratedly magnanimous. Near the beginning of 1906, Twain attended the funeral of a longtime servant of his. He spoke of this employee and friend as follows, while responding to a request for his definition of the word gentleman. "Nah, he was never old. Patrick came to us 36 years ago, a brisk, lithe young Irishman. He was as beautiful in his graces as he was in his spirit, and he was as honest a man as ever lived. For 25 years he was our coachman, and if I were going to describe a gentleman in detail, I would describe Patrick. At my own request, I was his pallbearer with our old gardener. He drove me and my bride so long ago. As the little children came along, he drove them too. He was all the world to them, and for all in my house he had the same feelings of honor, honesty, and affection. He was 60 years old. Howells suggests he was old. He was not so old. He had the same gracious and winning ways to the end. Patrick was a gentleman, and to him I would apply the lines, so may I be courteous to men, faithful to friends, true to my God, a fragrance of the path I trod. He was with us in New Hampshire, with us last summer, and his hair was just as black, his eyes were just as blue, his form just as straight, and his heart just as good as on the day we first met. In all the long years, Patrick never made a mistake. He never needed an order. He never received a command. He knew. I have been asked for my idea of an ideal gentleman, and I give it to you. Patrick McAleer. In 1906, Twain wrote Eve's Diary, a companion piece or bookend to Adam's Diary. Toward the end of 1906, Twain addressed a congressional subcommittee on copyright. He also inaugurated there, for its dramatic effect, and because he had always hated wearing black, his brilliant white suit, which later became something of a trademark. Twain had been concerned about copyright protection for quite some time, and was happy with the extension of copyright. He said about this, "I like the bill, and I like that it proposed extension from the present limit of copyright life of 42 years to the author's life and 50 years after. I think that will satisfy any reasonable author because it will take care of his children." Twain knew he wouldn't live much longer, and he was concerned about his daughters. Both Clara and Jean were still alive at the time. In 1960, 50 years after Twain's death, and thus at the end of the copyright period of his latest works, Clara was his sole remaining child. She died 2 years later in 1962. Twain's only grandchild, Nina Gabrilowitsch, died in 1966, just 4 years after the death of her mother, Clara.